Hey guys, welcome back to Digital Artcast. Thanks for joining me on yet another episode. As we continue our slog through 2020, we are approaching the kind of first point where the year's starting to move onwards, and with that, we are bringing a whole slew of new artists to talk to. The artist I have with me today is someone that, since we spoke to Scott Campbell not so long ago, we wanted to try and round out the trifecta of the Double Fine regime artists. And luckily today, this artist has gave up part of his day and his time to talk to me about the industry and his adventures in it. So we please welcome Mr. Lee Petty. Hi, Lee.
Hello. Hi. Thanks for having me.
You're more than welcome. It's a great honor to have you on. Definitely for me, because I was speaking to Lee before the podcast started recording and saying how the Double Fine team and their adventure into Kickstarter was kind of like what led me into the industry, because that was an interesting documentary in itself, where it was so revealing of like your entire process and everything you dived into. Although it seems like forever ago now, right? Like, because it was kind of so early on in the studio's inception, but yeah, like it was such an open doors kind of policy to just see how everything was dealt with, from Tim's writing to your art jams to, the programming, the scripting, all that kind of stuff. Does that seem like long ago now? Does that seem like forever ago? Or
Yeah, in some ways it does. I think, Double Fine, I think this year will be our 20th anniversary of being around.
wow,
And I've
wow,
been there about 13 years. I came on pretty much after Psychonauts, but the
okay,
Broken Age was, yeah, I think the reason why it seems like forever ago is just because the industry has changed so much. At the time,
yeah,
when we started the Kickstarter, that wasn't a thing for games, really. Like a few games had done it, little small things and
yep,
smaller projects. So it was so strange to think that was going to be a thing. And for a number of years, Kickstarter was big for games, and it
hmm,
really isn't so much anymore. But um, I think it kind of it feels like we kind of encapsulated a little era there. So when I think back,
yeah,
that's why it seems forever ago.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's just because it had that peak initially, and then it's kind of just tapered out into like a level playing field where there's so much on it now. But then you guys obviously opened the door for that. That was like you were the pioneers, the first ones through the entry pass, and now you've kind of set the bar for. Although I keep saying this, when I talk about Double Fine, I keep saying indie studios, like, but then I think, although you've stayed independent, you've always pushed your quality and the bar towards AAA at every point. So it's hard to call you guys in the studio when you've produced such incredible titles. Even looking back to when you were doing Brutal Legend or like you said Psychonauts, there was such a, because when you opened initially, the goal was like to be pushing in AAA quality and making games of a huge caliber that would release on Xbox and all these big consoles. And now, of course, most recently, you've came back into the Xbox family. So, it feels like you did taper out on your own for a while, but you still, I mean, did you always consider yourselves like a AAA studio? Was that something that was kind of ingrained in your the membrane of the studio?
Not really. What's interesting is I always feel that Double Fine, in some ways, has never really fit into any of these sort of standard industry ways of thinking about studios. I don't think we've ever really been a AAA studio. I mean, there was, maybe a blip on the radar, like in the earlier mid days of Brutal Legend, where our
Mm,
team size was maybe on the lower end of a AAA team before they had gotten
right.
giant. And
Yeah.
we had star power and voice actors and licensed music, so it had some of those qualities. But um,
Mm,
I think the type of our goal wasn't necessarily ever to build like giant franchises so we could just like milk them every year. And
yeah.
like from a business model or the way that AAA thinks of its franchises, we've never been that.
Right.
And
Okay.
you know and I think the way our teams are structured has never been like a AAA team.
Hmm.
And at the same time, uh, our smaller projects, many of which I've led, things like Stacking and Headlander and such, are many of those were funded by publishers, so it wasn't like true indie in some ways. But at the
Mm,
same time, it was. I would say that like how would I say that? Like, I think in general we tried to keep the production values as high as we could on those, so they didn't necessarily have, at least for the time, didn't really have. They were a little different than many of the other indie games, which tended to be at the time, anyways,
Hmm.
lower fidelity 2D only games, and we were still kind of making, these sort of 3D games with
Hmm.
a visual richness to them, and voice acting and things that also didn't really tend to typify indie games at that time. So,
Yeah.
um, we've always been kind of like one leg in multiple worlds, I think.
Yeah, but I think that's what's good about the studio is that it brings so many different elements, to independent making or the way of being creative in, a studio, especially, like you have Day of the Devs now, which, Tim's kind of been championing for a while. And even the thing like Amnesia Fortnite, which is, I feel unique to the industry in a whole. And of course, your studio, like, I think that's why such amazing ideas come out of that studio because it is just a whole studio of thinking outside the box constantly. Is that what originally kind of attracted you to working in Double Fine? Was that why they were kind of on your radar at that point?
Yeah, it's funny because I was working at Crystal Dynamics immediately before coming to Double Fine, and
Hmm.
when I first went to that, I had been there for about 5 years, I think. And when
Okay.
I went to that studio, they were kind of like the last of, or one of the last of the sort of mid-sized studios for the time. This is kind of
Right.
PlayStation 2 era.
Yeah.
And, I kind of really liked that size of studio where the teams weren't too big. They were maybe like 15 to 30 people, and they were still doing mostly original IP. They may have been doing some sequels, but like that's just like a team size and vibe that I always liked. And over time, most of those studios died and became, franchise machines or working on existing IP. And then
Yeah.
Double Fine, was quite opposite of that, right? Like they were, um, I always sort of admired their creativity. Like obviously I had played Psychonauts and really enjoyed it. And I had originally interviewed there right before they started Brutal Legend, and they wanted me to come on board for that. But I wasn't ready to move at that point, just in my life. And so I passed, and then like I think after they'd been working on it for a year and a half or so, they wanted me to interview again, and I came in and did that. And like at that point, I was like in a place in my life where I was like, okay, I'm ready to come over here. And they had spent most of that time kind of just building the tech for their new engine and working on some multiplayer prototypes. So the game world was still wide open, and
Yeah.
and it's funny. Like I tell Tim this sometimes. Like I'm not really a Tim Schafer fanboy. Like I did like LucasArts adventure games growing up, but I
Right.
actually
Yeah.
played more Sierra adventure games.
Okay.
And I mean, I do remember specifically being pretty enthralled with full throttle. I mean, that was probably the first time I remember seeing Tim's name. And I was actually working in the industry already when Grim Fandango came out. And
Right.
so I remember, I was at a company called Accolade at the time, and uh, someone told me like, "Oh, you got to check out this game. This game is so you, right?" And so
Hmm.
I was like, I played it, and I was like, "Oh, I can see why they said that," and
Yeah.
so I've had this like I've always kind of like and in another case that was funny was like there was a while before I went to Crystal, I had actually co-founded a game studio, and we were trying to develop an IP and get Microsoft to sign it for the first Xbox. And
Right.
so we showed them our pitch and the concept art, and they said, you know, this is kind of similar to something we just signed from Tim Schafer. And they wouldn't tell me what it was at the time. And
Right.
then, maybe like a year or so later, I saw an article came out about Psychonauts and Double Fine. I was like, oh,
Uh,
that's what they were talking about. And there was some similarities between the titles. And that was really, so it was kind of funny. I felt like there was a number of years where I was aware of Tim and,
yeah.
that. So it was kind of interesting. Yeah.
Overlapping anyway in the industry because well it happens because you're in the same industry, you're in the same kind of area. So but then were you when you moved from Crystal Dynamics, was that a hop across the country or were you already in the Bay Area? Were you in San Francisco at the time or?
No, I was in California still.
Yeah.
It wasn't
Okay.
a move. It was just more of a, kind of where I was on the project, and I had a young
Okay. Right.
kid, and that whole
Yeah.
thing. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, no, I've lived in really terrible places my whole life. Let's see, I was born in Hawaii and I lived there, and then I've lived in California. So I've lived in really
Okay.
terrible places that are terrible weather, and yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, oh, that's good. So then, so going back before even your art career started in the industry, was this something that like you went to school for traditionally? Did you do the whole degree program or go to an art school or college, or are you self taught or?
Yeah. So, yeah, I I did go to, I do have a degree in painting and drawing, a bachelor's of fine art in painting and drawing from San Jose State University. And when I was in high school, I did grow up playing video games, and when I was in high school, I still played them a bit. But I was really into writing and really into art and a little bit into programming. But I
Mhm.
never really thought about video games as a career. I mean, this would have been like the mid '80s, late '80s, so it really wasn't. Um,
Right.
and So I kind of decided that of those things that I was interested in, I wanted to focus on art. I was really more interested in being an artist, and I went into school for illustration, and then pretty quickly refocused. And I was like, I don't really want to do illustration. I want to do fine art. I want to paint. I want to learn about color and focus on that. And
Mhm.
um, there was no video game classes. There was no real 3D software really at that time. I mean, there was like
Okay.
AutoCAD, and so
Yeah.
no one was teaching that stuff at all.
Mhm.
And when I graduated, I thought I was going to go into grad school, so I kind of took a shitty office job for a couple years and tried to get into grad school, and that didn't really work out. And a friend of mine, um, or someone I knew from high school, it wasn't really even a friend,
Mhm.
said, "Hey, I'm working for this company, and we're doing this new thing called multimedia." And there's this new technology called CD-ROM. I'm serious. Like this makes me sound like I'm 900 years old.
Yeah.
Um, right. And he's like, I remember you always made like really cool, weird art in high school. And, do you want to come over? And we're actually also going to eventually start a gaming division. Right. So yeah,
Mhm.
that was kind of like and that wasn't really a game company, but that was like my first toehold into getting into digital art. And um, when I went there, it was basically like, yeah, I just had to teach myself all the sort of software. And there was, and it was mainly 2D at that point, but there was, it was like early days of Macromedia Director and Flash. And
Oh my
during
god.
my
Yeah.
time there, Mist came out, right, built on
Right. Okay.
HyperCard,
Yeah.
and so it was like kind of like that explosion of stuff. And then,
Yeah.
um, yeah, so that's kind of like first toehold into, I guess you'd say quasi video games, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you talk back about a lot of these things, and you're saying, "Oh, you feel old." I mean, I'm 34, and I had a career beforehand before I came into games. So, you know, that was my first early iterations of playing Tim's games was on a lot of the Amiga Spectrum, old PC Engine stuff, where
hmm
Monkey Island was ported into different places, and they had Day of the Technical, and I mean, like I have a whole, what's kind of drew Scott to me initially when he started talking to me was the fact that I have a massive Guybrush tattoo on my forearm. And he was like, "Oh yeah, Tim would love that," and that's also why I clicked. I was like, "Tim," I was like, "Oh yeah, you're Scott Campbell." So but yeah, like, but I know a moment for me. I was definitely freaking out that I got to meet him. So, but then yeah, it's interesting to think back about how you know I've seen the influence of how I got into games when I was younger, and how you probably got into games or was aware of them, and now how people consume games is almost like gaming is just it's part of our culture. It's such a
yeah,
stone clad thing in our day to day. You look at some of the most successful mediums of our time, the guys in Rockstar North just down the road from me in Edinburgh, who make Grand Theft Auto. GTA 5 is still one of the biggest franchise things, entertainment media things that's ever existed. It's in the billions and billions of dollars, more than TV, film, anything like that. So I suppose I'm trying to say, how do you feel the industry has shifted from kind of its initial inception when you kind of first got into it in the 90s and then where it is now? I mean, I know that's only maybe a span of 20 years, but even in then, games have accelerated at such a fast pace. Do you feel like there's a different way you approach making games now as opposed to, I mean, apart from the logistical stuff and software, but do you feel your mindset has changed since you entered the industry into how you're making like Psychonauts 2 at the moment? Do you feel that's it's such a different time or such a different way you made games compared to how you first got in the industry?
yeah, maybe a bit. I mean, I think when I think about being a kid and being into things like comics or science fiction or video games,
Mm,
punk music, all heavy metal, that stuff was all fringe. Like none of that was mainstream, right? Like it was
yeah.
all either like nerd fringe or other stuff. So,
Mhm.
and of course, I love. On one hand, I love that that is part of our culture now, in the sense that like, hey, I can actually make a living doing these things, right? Um,
Yeah.
but I'm sure, like most people who were into like weird French stuff as a teen or whatever, part of you is also like, like, it's changed and it's not as weird as it was. And um,
Yeah.
but it's not any regret. It's just like a thought that I think is natural to have. So I'm glad that more people can participate in it. And I was talking with someone the other day, and I remember like life before Nintendo. And the interesting thing about that is, what I mean by that is, when I was growing up, the games I played were all on like an Amiga or an Atari or those sort of things. And
Yeah.
you'd go to your computer store to buy games, and they had like floppy disks or cassette tapes even in little plastic baggies with a home printed software. Like, you could buy
Yeah.
games from truly independent creators. And what was really interesting at the time was like those games were some of those games were way more diverse in terms of their gameplay and topic than modern stuff. Like, it wouldn't be uncommon to walk in and like, oh, here's a game about the Franco-Prussian War, from the point of view of a bird. And that, like, that they had stuff like that because they're so abstract, the concept of the game, and the people who made them were weird alchemist computer nerds or whatever. So it
Yeah.
was it was it was interesting. And like over time, and then of course Atari 2600 came out, and
Mhm.
consoles came out. um Even in the Atari 2600 days, there was quite a bit of diversity in some ways of games, although they
Yeah.
started, losing some of that. And, then the industry collapsed, and Nintendo came in and turned the whole industry into a child's toy,
Yeah.
basically, and I'm glad someone saved the industry in some ways, but it took
Mhm.
forever after that for people to stop seeing games as Christmas presents for kids. And
Yeah.
I actually really regret that. I kind of always wonder what the alternate timeline would have been
Oh God,
if
no.
like, if that hadn't happened, right? If it had just sort of stayed like, uh, I don't know, somehow kept moving forward in a different way, because I
Mhm.
remember early working in the industry, I was always frustrated. It was like my first 7 years in the industry is like, all I did was crunch every summer to try and get something out for Christmas. And it was always like, about box placement on the shelf and being a Christmas present, and then trying to appeal to moms to buy for their kids or whatever. And it was just such a like, I was so not interested in that way of thinking about games. And that's Nintendo's fault, really.
Yeah, yeah.
So
They're to blame.
they are.
But then I think for an accolade, even the guys who when Satoru Iwata, passed not recently, and people were looking back on his history in Nintendo and how he changed the game industry and how Nintendo did. I think
Yeah,
it's just a general look into the biggest pillars that are in gaming, and I think it's great because what I think is awesome about working somewhere like Double Fine is that you're in the vicinity of Tim, and he and his team. At the time, obviously, he was part of a collective at the time, including Ron, where point and click adventures became another pillar, right, of the industry and how we define. And then you look back into how I think probably what he done for the industry was introduce storytelling into games as a medium, because at that point there were asteroids, there were shooting games, there were Centipede, but then
yep,
he introduced dialogue, he introduced the human element of it. And now you look at some of the most successful franchises that have come out over the last god only 10, 15 years. But I remember looking back in a retrospective of the whole Telltale game series and Walking Dead, and what those guys done, in the Bay Area with storytelling as a medium, and how, when their Walking Dead series launched, and then they had stuff like Wolf Among Us, things that, initially had been in a medium for TV, but then it was an interactive medium again because games came into it. So they were almost picking that flag up from Tim and flying it again. I mean, do you feel that like that is a pillar almost of the studio? In fact, is storytelling? Is that something that you really put a heavy emphasis on when it comes to making your games?
that's a really good question. And I have like mixed feelings about the word storytelling in games, and I say that only because um, I think there are so many different ways to tell a story, and I think people, of course, are still figuring it out in interactive medium what that actually means. And I think AAA has adopted basically more trappings of the movie industry, and yeah, they're telling stories in games, but they're mainly telling stories through cutscenes, which more and more increasingly share movie production pipelines. And there's nothing wrong with
Mm.
that, right? Like, they're beautifully put together, and certainly Double Fine, especially Tim games, tend to
Mhm.
have cutscenes in them as well.
Yeah.
But I do feel like that's maybe not the most interesting way to approach storytelling. And sometimes that's all people mean by storytelling, or dialogue trees, or lots of talking. But there's also just the idea of games telling stories through not only their mechanics but everything in
Hmm.
the game, the music and the structure of the environments and all of that sort of
Hmm.
stuff. And I do feel like that that sort of that way of thinking about games holistically as to maybe world building or telling a story is something that is a quality of Double Fine games,
Hmm.
and something I'm interested in. I'm less
Okay.
interested in like super talky things with cutscenes, which I kind of felt like a lot of the Telltale stuff was, even though like
Yeah.
they were really well executed, and they I think they did a lot for legitimizing writers and narrative designers in the industry, which has been great. But
Yeah.
like myself, coming from a visual background, I like to think of in games in part. I try to like think of the worlds as making paintings too, and
Yeah.
I guess that's my favorite part about creating games too, is just thinking about all the world building and things that go into that layer as well,
Yeah.
and how to kind of weave that in and out of the game, without even
Yeah.
saying anything. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, is that an interesting even look upon yourself as a retrospective, kind of looking inward from out? Do you see yourself more as a game dev than an artist?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think I don't think about it too often, I guess, but I do feel like a lot of the role that I filled over the number of years is certainly using my art abilities, but also I'm pretty good at structuring game development and problem solving, and know how to be pretty efficient there. So that those things tend to be more in demand, honestly, in some ways. So I feel like I always try and do what the project needs the most of to kind of move it forward. And sometimes that means I spend a lot of time on visual stuff. Sometimes it means I spend less time on that and more thinking about the game holistically, or helping
Mm,
structure the pipeline and tools and process that drive the game. So it kind of really depends on the project and who else is on the project, and what as a team you can bring to the project, because ultimately it's a team effort.
yeah.
And um, I'm flexible, but I do
Mm,
say that if I was retired and I had money was no concern, and I was just making interactive things, they
hmm.
would be like very visually heavy and super fucking weird, and
Yeah.
and that's what I would want to do, right? Like that. So
Yeah.
so and but yeah, I think I just love the concept of having a world. Like for me, games are, and I don't necessarily mean world in the sort of like Marvel Cinematic Universe sort of the word like that, which is what everyone sort of thinks about now when you think world building, because
Yeah.
that's where all the money is. I just
Of
mean the
course.
idea that like somehow just wandering around in a space in interactive medium is evocative in and of itself. With even
Yeah.
like basically very little no mechanics, just like moving through a space is really interesting. And like I love the idea of just thinking about what's in that space and the history of that space and all of the things you can encounter in that space. And it's like, guiding a figure, whether it's first person or third person or side scroll or
Mm.
whatever. It's like you're a kid again, kind of imagining moving through this world with an action figure, or yourself in this action figure, some sort of avatar. And I love all that stuff.
Yeah, I think it's also when people talk about, some particular games, when they say that the main character is the world, is the world you inhabit, not actually the protagonist. It's interesting to look at guys like Hideo Kojima, who have just put out things like Death Stranding, and people took that game as almost it's like a moving piece of art as opposed to a video game interactive experience,
Hmm.
because that whole storytelling element he's done is so at the behest of the player, and is so driven by the player, that he almost fills these worlds for you to uncover your own narrative, and doesn't really want to force you to tell a particular story. Do you feel like that's what you came across when you ventured into something like stacking, where it was so driven by the player? Was that an interesting look on how you were building those worlds or that narrative within games?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, um, on one hand, part of it's just like aligning all the elements in the game. Like, I try it when I lead a project like stacking. I want everything to feel um, aligned with itself. So, for example, you're playing the smallest doll in this world of living Russian dolls, the smallest doll alive,
Mm,
but you have the ability to like stack into other dolls and temporarily kind of take control of them to solve these
mhm,
problems.
Yeah.
And so, there's a theme there about being the underdog, right? And
Mhm.
it turns out that like almost always like the kids are solving the world of the adults in that game,
Yeah.
so there's those themes, but there's also just like, because the game mechanics involve like using these dolls' abilities to solve things, and you have to stack up sometimes and stack down.
Mhm.
We had to make the player really aware of the different sizes of the dolls, and that as
Mhm.
just as a game mechanic necessity. And
Yeah.
then that sort of that idea was simultaneous with the idea that I wanted to make a game about classism a bit, right? So you have these,
Yeah.
and a lot of my inspirations were not Russian mythology as much as like things like Tale of Two Cities or Oliver or something along those lines.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Dickinsonian themes, right? So you have so we're already making you aware of these sizes, and so then we started incorporating stuff into the world where we you'd go into a bathroom and there'd be like toilet
Mm.
seats of different
Mm.
sizes, sort of
Okay.
implying that they've set up. If you're a big doll, you get to use this big toilet that's above these small toilets, right? Or
Mm.
the part there were like the benches out in the waiting room of the train station. They were also sorted and stacked by size, or the tables in the lounge were that way. And what you notice
Yeah.
is like the big dolls are always tend to be these sort of industrialists or the captains of the
Mm.
thing, and the smaller dolls, which tend to do all the work, are held down by the bigger dolls, are always those medium and small dolls. So
Right.
that was kind of aligning some of the themes with the mechanic itself and telling the same story without ever telling that particular side of the story. Because the story we were telling was a more straightforward one, just about Charlie, the main character,
Mm.
sort of as an underdog trying to like save his family from these bigger forces.
Yeah.
But the really like moment to moment stories are those other things, and
Yeah.
that only really worked with an interactive thing because that's kind of what you need to do as a player. And then there's
Yeah.
just the other sort of theme there, which was just like the answer to all these puzzles
Mhm.
that move the game forward is always about getting a group of dolls to work together, right? So
Yeah.
it's a I don't know, a little a socialist subversion in there as well, where it's not about like finding the one magic inventory item. And ultimately these dolls are the inventory items and the characters and the people in the world, and you fix the problems when they all work together as opposed to against each other. And so those themes all kind of that's a story that's just told through the gameplay. And it's not always easy to do something like that, especially when your game is less abstract, but I think it's always worth thinking about and considering, because that's the sort of subtext and depth of the game that I think is different
Mm.
than say a movie or a novel.
Yeah, and do you feel? I mean, probably talking more to your writing side than your. But then again, as an artist, you hold many different hats within that realm of being an artist, and writing is one of them. But do you feel, stuff like you mean, modern day? I think America and other things in the world are aimed towards people talking about things like stoicism and socialism again as a mainstream idea. And of course now with Sanders, I think rolling the polls through the way of the successes he's had. Do you feel like it's sometimes games' job to incorporate a social or economical speech into the games that you're making, or do you feel like that's something that should be left out with?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way I think about it, when I was in art school, there was a lot of quote unquote political art, and ultimately everything has some point of view in political context, and there's no way it
Mm,
doesn't. Even if
yeah.
it's not intentional, it's still communicated, it's still created in a cultural context. So
Mm,
I think that's fine. I personally, I'm more of a postmodernist and not a metamodernist, which means that
okay.
I actually prefer subtext. I actually prefer
Yeah.
that there's layers of that you have to dig through,
Mm,
and I because I find the journey to find that meaning is, if
mm,
it's layered, is more open to interpretation and therefore ultimately more meaningful to the player than just like, here's this strong point of view, right? But
mm,
that's not because I think it's wrong or that games are apolitical or should be. It's just my preference
mm,
as an artist in terms of how I like to layer things. And
yeah.
um, but yeah, absolutely, games should have a point of view.
Mm,
And I also feel like it's okay to play and read and watch things that have a different point of view from yourself. Obviously, people like
mm.
to highlight the extremes. Like, I don't really want to play like a pro Nazi,
Yeah, of
like
course. Yeah, yeah,
killing game necessarily, but
yeah, yeah,
there most things in reality are not that straightforward, and I do feel
yeah.
that like I don't have to share all the same values as the author of a work to
Yeah.
engage with it, right? And I can even
Yeah.
find, potentially some of it a little like, whoa, that's a little cringy. I think it's totally fine for people to make their own call on that. That's kind of my call is
Yeah.
how I engage with it. You know.
No, yeah, because we just had Alex Beddoes on, and he was talking about how we were talking in general, because he was talking about how he's attending some of Jordan Peterson's lectures, and people have an independent view of how he is as a person, but then what you can take away from every walk of life is your own view on how that affects your part of your life, and how you move forward with that information. I mean, I think in general, there's a whole move towards extremism in the world. You look at Amazon, who have just, run with that show with Al Pacino called I think it's Nazi Hunters, where, it's a retelling of something that actually happened in America way back in the day when people reformed alliances to hunt down Nazis within American structures. So I think it's interesting when you look at those juxtapositions of extreme views and how they're influencing every aspect of media now. But I think actually games are probably managed in a way to stay clear of that. Apart from a bit, obvious stuff like Wolfenstein, where that is a retelling of killing Nazis in a sense. But then you don't see a lot of extreme views in games, or I don't feel like I've came across anything that's been very extreme. Is there anything you've came across, or do you think that games have took on an extreme view in some places, or do you think it's still the same message of having fun with a character in a game?
Yeah, it's interesting. Most commercial games, or at least bigger commercial games, right? Like really want to provide, a fun experience, and
Mm,
people find different things fun. Like for some
yeah.
people, combat intense competitive games are too stressful. Um,
Mm,
and for others, they're not. For some people, games that are dialogue heavy exploration games are too slow paced and boring, and for others, they're not. And I guess I would just hope that ideally there'd be a sustainable industry where there could be all those different varieties of games, and people could just
mm,
understand people prefer different things.
mm,
I think whenever it feels imbalanced, like it maybe does in AAA, where it's like all pushed into really really high production values that are very movie like, and most of it
mm.
is like like lone warrior white dudes with shaved heads neck stabbing people, and like, and then those companies come out and are like, this game isn't political. I'm like, well, actually it is, right? Like actually
Yeah,
it's like inherently pro war on some level, and
yeah,
you're basically playing a mass murderer, and you maybe throw a few like ridiculous little statements in there about how, oh, it just happened to be Arabs. You're like, okay guys, like
yeah,
in the world that we live in, there's a political context to that, whether you intended or not. So I mean,
yeah,
it's fine if it's not one I want or I want to play, right? I don't think
yeah.
they're evil for doing it necessarily, but like,
Of course,
let's
yeah,
not pretend like, I guess
yeah,
but it is always an interesting challenge. Like if you brought up Death Stranding, like that in some ways that is a super unfun game, right? And a
yeah,
lot of grindiness. And yeah, I mean, I think part or all of that was intentional.
yeah,
But it also like is kind of a painful thing to play. That's more like a chore than a game for a lot of people. And
yeah.
I it's an interesting thing because like maybe I don't know how it's sold or anything, but it's interesting that
Mm,
because of his name and because of the
mm,
big marketing push,
mm.
they're able to do something like that.
Yeah,
And maybe people still bought it because of the production values. But like picture that game. Well, what if that game was ugly and not marketed by that? Would people even play it? And I don't know the answer to that. I would hope that there's always going to be a smaller market for things that are harder to digest. I mean, you see that in film
yeah,
and everything else. But I hope there's always a way for that to make money, so that people don't have to like live in their parents' basements and not have medical coverage just to make interesting things,
yeah,
right? Which is
yeah,
kind of where indie gaming is nowadays, right? Like,
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, it depends on the indie game, I suppose, because there's guys who have found immense success. You look at the guys at like Supergiant Games, who have made stuff like Bastion and, most recently, Hades, like
Hmm.
they've had immense success, but of course they started in their parents' home and built a studio out of that. So, there is definitely, I think, extremes where you have small time indie studios that make no money and then small time indie studios that make like millions, they're rich. So it's a thing where I think in this world in general, if we had to overarch the entire theme of this conversation, is that there isn't a lot of balance in the world anymore. Everything's
Mm.
just 1 or 0, and I suppose, I don't know if it was something where it was inevitable that you guys went back to Xbox to try and, you know, rekindle that, you know, that franchise, to maybe find a different way of making games again? Or, you know, was it something that, I mean, this is probably more a studio talk question, like you individually as an artist, but then, you know, you've been part of that uh, atmosphere for so long. Did you feel like it was inevitable you were going to go back to Xbox at one point, or do you think it was something that was not a last minute decision, but something that maybe came up recently where you were then reintroduced to the idea of coming back?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't really involved too much with that decision making
Mm,
process, but stuff that Tim has said throughout Double Fine, my time at Double Fine, is that Double Fine is an inspiration driven studio. And I know
okay.
that he, in the past, when acquisition talks came up, he was always cautious or resistant in that he didn't want to like be brought on to be like, okay, now you are going to just be making Connect games or adventure games or whatever.
Right.
He wanted enough flexibility to be able to do that. And so, that's kind of difficult for a publisher to buy you for that, especially if you don't have like a single tentpole franchise. Like, we
Right.
might have games that are more popular than others, but we've done a lot of different types of games. I think,
Mm,
I think in the case of Microsoft, with the sort of industry has been evolving towards platforms now, much like movies have,
okay.
like Netflix and stuff. And so,
Yeah.
what's interesting, I mean, it's kind of up in the air as to how well those models will work or anything, but I think
Yeah.
Microsoft, and this isn't an official Microsoft statement. This is just my
No, no, no,
feeling
of
about
course.
it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
they, um, my feeling is that one of the reasons they'd be interested in Double Fine is because they probably want to bring a diversity of types of games to their streaming platform that are
Yeah.
maybe games that you can only get there, or at least distinct enough from other games. And Double
Yeah, of
Fine over the
course.
last number of years has been able to like pretty regularly produced a lot of different types of games. And I
Yes.
think, for us, that might be a really good fit because at that point, the onus isn't necessarily on coming up with the biggest selling game. It's,
Mm,
if you look at a platform as a whole, it's like it's the collection of different things that always show up on a regular basis that might draw you back to that platform, right?
of
Like
course.
not
Yeah.
everything on Netflix is a Stranger Things, but they're always
Yeah.
launching something. And some of them are like you're willing to watch and are interesting, even if it doesn't become like the biggest selling game ever, And
Mm,
I think that's kind of a good fit for us because we make a lot of decisions that aren't necessarily like commercial in nature, you know?
mm.
And
Yeah,
it's not that we don't want people to like or play our games, but I feel
of
like
course.
we want our games to feel like they're made by humans, to have personality, to be a little different, and to represent some of our weird ideas and stuff. And
Yeah.
that could work well in that sort of strategy. So I hope, I would imagine that this was part of the thought process, and I think that if so, and it works
Mm.
out, then I think it'd actually be a good fit for us.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like that's something that the industry, you talk about Netflix and Amazon, they, I think, actively seek out those studios that are different or doing things a wee bit off kilter, where they feel that that's going to give them the edge when it comes to pulling people in and making them see that, oh no, it's worth investing in our platform because, of course, we have this and we have this and we have this thing as well. So, especially in the last, I think it's funny to say console generations now because the way consoles come out at this point, it's just like an iPhone, like they're just every 2 years or something else
Yeah.
that's popping out the stratosphere. But if you look back at typically how Xbox was initially marketed when the Xbox One came out, even because Phil wasn't even in charge at that point. The number of exclusives was almost zero. PlayStation was just like every other month throwing games that were different or a bit strange, or of course everybody talked about how when Kojima kind of fell out of the market, Sony just automatically just snapped them up almost instantaneously before he was even out of Konami. So um I feel like Xbox is now that Phil is kind of at the head or the helm of it, and he's came from a gaming background and run game studios, so he probably feels that like this is what Xbox needs, is this diversity, right? Is this
Yeah.
look into games that you can't get anywhere else but Xbox. So and of course xCloud is now a thing, and that's kind of making waves. So yeah, I think it makes sense that they'll be looking to bring in, even in the UK where I'm from, they recently acquired Ninja Theory, who are now,
Yep.
or just at the Game Awards, produced the new Hellblade trailer that came out, and that was all in real time, and it looked incredible. So yeah, I think that's why they're looking at these different smaller studios, because they want this diversity in the platform and their portfolio. So yeah, it's an interesting time. But then, of course, the emphasis for you as a studio is still on making awesome games with great stories, and of course, Psychonauts is is rounding out now, right? You guys are probably heading towards or roughly the end goal at this point. Like you're in, I'd imagine the end game. Well, you can't speak to specifics, but I think it was due out last year, but then of course you guys pushed it back. So is that still like your daily drive? Are you still kind of hard at work on Psychonauts 2? Is that still kind of the main focus?
Yeah, I can't talk about anything that hasn't been announced yet, but I think our that's certainly our kind of next big push for the studio, and I think for Microsoft as well. So or Microsoft as it relates to Double Fine and stuff.
Yeah,
but yeah. That's where that is what most of the studio is currently working on.
It's the day to day, yeah, definitely. So then you've got this whole career at Double Fine. You've came from the kind of OG background in games development and that side of the world. So, what is it that you would? I mean, do you have a fulfillment outside of your work where you still want to be creating things artistically? I mean, I know when we spoke to Scott, for example, last he was talking about, how he still tries to do some shows or has moved, into, children's books as well, or, tries to exhibit or do things outside of the norm game production cycle. Is there stuff that you work on outside of, Psychonauts and Double Fine that also defines you as an artist? Is there something that you have like a passion project almost outside?
Yeah. I have a few things I like to work on outside. I think it's really important for artists to continue to do projects outside their professional lives. It's very challenging, of course, because it takes a lot out of you to work professionally in films or comics or games, and but there's a way of just keeping your creativity rekindled when you're doing your own projects, and I've always found that there's a feedback loop between them. It actually benefits my job that I do personal projects because I might stumble across something that works well, or even just if it's just a technique that I can kind of bring back to my job at times. So,
right.
I think it's important. So for me, I'm always I try perhaps futilely to try and maintain as many skill sets as I can, so I'm always I try and do 2D work and 3D work outside of work.
Okay.
I have I try and keep designing things too and writing things. So I do have a few really long-term ones that I slowly chip away at. Like I have this board game I've been making for ages called Pettyland. And it's this, it's funny because I actually started making it, and this is going to make me sound 900 again, but I actually started making it in 1989. And,
wow.
And I actually had a fully playable version of it by 1990 or 91. And it never had art, but it was mechanically playable. And it's this board game, this sort of up to 8-player board game, kind of focuses on 8 players. And I kind of put it away and forgot about it for ages after that. And then about 5 years ago or so, I was someone I knew from the time was like, "Hey, can you bring that game over you made for ages ago? I want to play it." And so I was like, "Hey, maybe I should actually illustrate this thing now and update its mechanics a bit." And so on and so forth. So yeah, I slowly chip away. I still occasionally do play tests with that. I have a whole bunch of illustrations I've done for it. I think it's unfortunate. It's it requires at least, I think it's I counted, it's 168 unique illustrations for the cards. So, I've done, 50 or so in my spare time. They're black and white, kind of pen and ink. So it's a 2D sort of thing, and very different from the sort of work I do at Double Fine. So that's kind of, I have that. And then I also just try and, the last couple of years, I've been really into creating art in VR, using some of the new VR tools, and that's primarily been 3D work.
Nice.
And so it's not.
Are you using a Medium for that, or?
Yeah, Medium, Tilt Brush, Gravity Sketch.
Okay.
All those sorts of products, and kind of mix and mash them and stuff. And so that's been fun. And actually, even for my last project I led at Double Fine, which was a game called Rad, I actually brought the VR pipeline into Double Fine, and we did actually use it for some concept development based on just some of the experimentation I'd done at home in a more just art creation way. So, I think it's important to always do that. Of course, I do shows every once in a while, but I don't focus on it nearly as much as say Scott or Bagel. Usually once or so a year, I'll have a piece in a group show, or maybe a couple times a year. But it's kind of of the many things I try and maintain, those tend to go away. Yeah.
I mean, it does sound like you're trying to spin multiple plates at once and try and keep them all in the air as you kind of move forward. And I think for me, that was one of the biggest struggles coming into this industry because, as an engineer, you're defined by your job and what you do from day to day. And I
Yeah.
always felt like picking a specialization, although I have eventually picked, environment art and 3D, but I felt like if I put that hat on, I could never take it off. And I felt like,
Yeah.
once you're defined by that role, you're always going to be defined by that. But it seems like you don't like the pigeonhole of, I am this, whether it be an artist, a writer, a 3D sculptor, whatever. You like to wear multiple hats. You like to be constantly evolving or changing. Is that the right word you would use for it?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. It is something that, I mean, I think teams are best when they have people who are both specialists and people who are generalists. I think, it's nice to have a mix of people on the team. But, when productions get larger, it becomes difficult you kind of do have to specialize more and departmentalize more. It's just the nature of trying to manage a bigger group of human beings to do something. And so, that's one of the reasons I like working on teams that aren't too big is I have the opportunity to, to kind of do more things. But yeah, for me, it's that weird, like satisfying, but also incredibly frustrating, right? Like when I really like doing multiple things and trying to maintain multiple skill sets, but then of course I have friends or coworkers who kind of focus on a smaller area, and they're more amazing at those things than I am, and part of me is like, why can't I just? You should do that because look how much better they are than you are at that thing, and
Yeah.
but I think I do a pretty good job being at least decent at a few different things. But it's
Yeah.
it's hard, it's hard. Like there's that side, but then but yeah, it's nice. It's nice having the opportunity to be able to kind of do multiple things as well. It keeps things fresher. You don't get burnt out.
Yeah, I think the diversity almost is something that people will crave eventually because, like you said, if you do one thing consistently for long enough, it will eventually just, unless you're doing something new with the medium, then it will eventually grain on you that you want to try and expand beyond your horizons. I mean, I know for Scott, again, when we talked, he was talking about, making some of the more funny illustrations at the time or the more comical stuff was bringing him away from the industry because at the time, I think specifically, he was talking about working on Brutal Legend, right? When a lot of the stuff was like dark and mysterious and, gothic or whatever, and then
Mm-hmm.
he was doing these kind of funny illustrations at home because it was, the balance where he wasn't feeling so down all the time about making this stuff that was so, dark or whatever. But yeah, I think it's one of these things you naturally look outside of yourself for because you want to almost play in that place. Because for me, I think art is a play or playful experience that you want to feel like you're playing during it, not that you're working. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's sometimes where the balance in this industry can be off, where when art meets industry, right, and you have an art industry, that's when people become downtrodden or feel empty because the industry is taking that part of them away. Do you feel like that's something you're constantly fighting against?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's true. Something artists always go through, and I think I do fight it. Even though double finding is pretty accommodating for it, I do fight it in the sense that as I mentioned earlier, I tend to be very efficiency minded and
Mm.
very process oriented, and I try to bring that organization and process to a team. But a part of me hates that I'm good at it. Because I feel like it was never like a career goal for me, right? I just am
Yeah.
naturally pretty good at that sort of thing, and I always try and solve problems to just keep things moving forward.
Yeah.
So I yeah, but I do think I sometimes miss out on the creative playfulness that could maybe enrich my work even more.
Yeah.
So I try and keep it in mind, but at the same time, I see what happens when people don't do that, and it's just it's also just flights of
Yeah.
fantasy that never get on screen, and
Mm.
then they get stressed out, and then ultimately someone steps in and takes control away from them, and they get frustrated. So
Mm.
like it's tricky either way, but I think
Yeah.
being an artist. Being an artist is always a struggle. The creative process is always a struggle, and there's a different set of struggles when you're doing it as a living.
Mm.
But overall, I'd say that everyone who gets to make art for a living is very lucky, myself included. I feel very fortunate all the time. I think about my grandfather working in a coal mine when he was 14 to put food on the
Oh,
table, and
wow.
I'm like,
Yeah.
you know what? I am pretty fucking lucky. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't, push for the industry to be improved or more humane. Like, absolutely, like that should be
Of
the right
course,
of
yeah.
every human being. But
Yeah.
I try and keep that in mind, like I'm
Yeah,
so
yeah.
lucky. I'm so like when I get frustrated or I feel burned out, I'm like, you know how lucky you are. So I try and keep that in mind.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like it's such a thing just now recently, especially people kind of bringing out videos every other day on YouTube about how they're quitting their job at different industries, or they're doing these things where they feel like, oh, I'm downtrodden in this career, and again, it's a thing where we're not saying that you need to be stepped on in a job. You need to be obviously respected for what you do, but yeah, sometimes I think people need to pinch themselves. And I remember we were having a conversation when I early on was getting into the industry, and we are having a conversation about rates to pay or conditions or holidays or stuff like that, and rumors from different studios. And one of the guys next to me was like, man, we get to make games for a living, so it can't be that bad. And I'm like, you know what? Yeah, I used to dig holes in the ground for a living, so I totally understand. Yeah, I almost had to catch myself. I'm like, you realize what your job was like 5 years ago, right? You realize what you were doing. I'm like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, yeah, I think you definitely have to take the rough with the smooth, and where this industry will present problems initially because you're coming up against industry and budgets and time restraints and deadlines. You still are getting to be creative for a living, and that in itself is a blessing. I think that we usually forget about. So, yeah, I definitely agree with everything you said there. So yeah, I'm kind of at the point where I think we've had an awesome talk. I've really enjoyed everything we've talked about. I think it's been incredible. You've gave some really amazing answers to everything I've kind of thrown at you, and I thank you for that, Lee. It was really awesome to just take an hour of your time to just talk about life and art in general. And what have you kind of got planned for the rest of the day? I think you said you're working from home, right?
Yeah, I'm working from home today, which is a kind of a rare treat, but it's
Right.
nice. Yeah, so I'm in my studio and I'm working on some new things for the
Cool.
studio. So
Nice,
yeah,
nice. Cool.
pretty
Awesome.
cool.
Cool.
Yeah,
Yeah, cool, man. Well, again, thank you for coming on and taking the time to speak to us. It was really amazing, and yeah, just hope you have an awesome rest of the day. If you guys want to leave any comments or questions for Lee, chuck them in the down below part of the YouTube machine. If you're listening on a podcast service, of course, you can reach out to us via email. You'll find that in the description. And I'll also post in Lee's social media accounts and anything he's wanting to link to as well. You can either get in touch or appreciate his art from wherever he posts it up. And my thanks again to Lee for coming on, and you guys for listening. And yeah, we'll catch you again in the next episode. Thanks, guys.
thanks.